Welcome to a very special show which highlights the need for greater safety on the roads for you, for me, and, well, everyone in the country. India has the world's worst traffic and road safety record with the highest number of road deaths. Now, we want to tell you that this is something that has been ignored for very long, and finally now we have a situation where hopefully change is at hand. Now, all of these accidents that we're talking about, well, there are more than 1,200 of them on the roads every day. They result in 377 deaths. That's like a whole plane full of people, a 747, crashing every day. Of course, amongst this, there are 14 who are children dying every day in road accidents across the country. Car accidents account for a portion, of course, of all of that, but it's a number that is also rising. And so to highlight just how vehicle safety is one of the many ways to reduce that number, last year Global NCAP took upon itself to carry out crash tests of made-in-India cars. We had brought you that story exclusively as well. The cars tested were 5 popular and best-selling hatchback models, since India is a small car-heavy market: the Tata Nano, Maruti Suzuki Alto 800, Hyundai i10, Ford Figo and Volkswagen Polo. The results were anything but impressive. All 5 cars failed the test. Remember, only base variants are used for any such test, and none of the cars offered airbags or ABS as standard. Having said that, the Figo and Polo had done well when it came to structural rigidity. Now, we are also looking at a second round of tests. We're not letting that story go, I can tell you. We believe that India deserves safer cars, and luckily, I am not the only one here. There are other people who agree with me on that, and in fact, I have with me here in our studio the chairman of Global NCAP, Max Mosley. It's good to have you here with us. Alongside him, we also have David Ward, the Secretary General of Global NCAP. Welcome, David. Dr. Rohit Baluja represents IRTE from here in Delhi, and also right next to me here is Thomas Ehrenberg, who heads Volvo's business here in India. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. We're also joined by the Secretary, Ministry of Road Transport and Highways, Mr. Vijay Chibbar, and also a special guest joining in from Mumbai, the man who heads the automotive and farm equipment sectors for Mahindra & Mahindra, Dr. Pavan Goenka. Many thanks all of you for joining us. We also have a very special studio audience here with us today, and I can tell you that we want to quickly lead off by talking about that second round of tests that I mentioned. Second round of NCAP crash tests for made-in-India cars were carried out over the past few months, and one of them is a very popular model, the other a relatively new entrant. Now, I'm not naming the cars just yet, but very quickly, let me first ask you, Max Mosley, why was it important to focus on India? I mean, why did you need to come in here? You've already got a whole lot that happens vis-a-vis safety in Europe, in the US. Why India?
Well, I think it became clear that, first of all, as you've said, the casualty rate here is enormous. Then it's a huge car market. And so it makes sense that we look at the cars, because at the moment there is no minimum regulation in India. I believe one is coming, but the United Nations minimum regulations don't apply. So it seems an ideal place to come and do some testing in order to inform the consumers.
David, you were accused of creating some kind of trouble by certain manufacturers, I know, but that's something that you're used to. It's not something that will deter you.
Yes, because actually we find, both Max and myself, we were involved 20 years ago in creating a similar program called the European New Car Assessment Program, and exactly the same thing happened then. And in fact, the quality of the vehicles was similar. The regulatory standards were too low. And when we launched Euro NCAP, in fact, on the very day we launched Euro NCAP, the industry organized a rival event and denounced what we were doing. But quite soon after, within a year or so, the manufacturers had adjusted to this new environment, and they recognized that we're actually all trying to achieve the same thing, which is safer cars for their customers. And by informing the consumer, by giving them the opportunity to see the different performance and the quality of safety that improves with airbag technology and so on, then in fact they will sell safer cars. And so in the end, we think it's a win-win. But very often when you start a program like this, it causes some surprise amongst some of the manufacturers. But we're very confident that a country as dynamic as India can respond to this challenge.
Well, I can tell you that we, of course, reached out to a number of car makers, the entire industry, in fact, to try and get reactions on what all of this means. We do have two of them here with us today, of course, as you know, both Mahindra and Volvo, supporting a lot of what's been said here. So that's encouraging, though that's not the case with every manufacturer. All right, let's go ahead and introduce you to the first of the crash tests that I mentioned. This is a car that was crashed a few days ago. The Datsun Go is a new low-cost car that was launched earlier this year. It's the revival of the Datsun brand by Nissan, and the car is made for India and will soon be shipped to South Africa as well from the Renault-Nissan plant in Chennai. Now, you can actually take a look at that car getting crashed. The Go is, of course, not offered with airbags or ABS in any of its variants. It is a cheap entry car. It's designed to address the kind of market that's been dominated by Maruti with the Alto 800 and now, of course, Hyundai with the Eon as well. Let's take a look at the crash test. All right, wasn't obvious enough to you? Well, the car didn't do well naturally. You could see a lot of that. Poor protection for the driver and passenger. Number of fatal injuries sustained, and the body shell also rated as extremely unstable. You can see why, of course, the car then came back with absolutely a 0-star rating. And let's have a quick look at the analysis further from there. What is, of course, looked at is not just what happens to the car itself, but also its occupants, remember. And in the case of this accident, simulated at 64 kilometers per hour, you did have the crash test dummies sustaining extremely fatal injuries as well. And in fact, the driver's side crash test dummy in particular looking extremely difficult there. And you're not surprised then why it comes back with a 0-star rating. Now, let me go ahead and get a quick question into Vijay Chibbar. The government has been talking, Mr. Chibbar, about finally addressing this much required need in the country. What is the government's current position on a sort of a new revised sort of regime for modern vehicle safety?
Well, as you're aware, the Motor Vehicle Act is a fairly old piece of legislation. It was felt that we need to improve upon this legislation quite significantly. And towards that end, we have made a draft of a new road transport safety bill. This bill has drawn from various sources in terms of ideas and in terms of what we need to achieve. And it's through a process of consultation that we have developed this draft bill.
Pawan Goenka, let me come across to you next. We have now finally started to see, like I said, a slightly different environment than what there was just a few days ago. You just heard there from Mr. Chibbar as well. Are you encouraged by this?
So let me start off by saying that there is no doubt that the fatalities and road accidents are amongst the worst in India. And there's no doubt, and thanks partly to what you did about 6 months ago, there's a lot more awareness and concern about the road safety and road accidents in India. I also want to add that in order for us to get to where we want to be, it is an interplay between the man and the machine and the environment that it works in. And therefore, to bring the road safety at the level, we have to ensure that we take care of all 3 or 4 stakeholders that contribute to it. I'm going to limit my comments on the machine, that is the car, because that's what as an OEM we can influence. So I would like to say that as far as technology is concerned, there is absolutely no sort of gap that Indian manufacturers, whether Indian OEMs or multinationals, have compared to what may be available anywhere else. What we are concerned about is whether the Indian consumer is willing to pay for that technology. And clearly that is driven partly by regulations, as Mr. Chibbar said, and partly by the awareness that the consumers have on what a safer car would do for them. Now, one of the things that we have been suffering from is that clearly the OEMs have been offering safety technology in more expensive variants, and therefore sometimes people who cannot afford it have to pay for many other things that has nothing to do with the safety, which they don't want. And one of the initiatives that we have taken is to ensure that in our newer models, we offer safety features such as airbag and ABS, even in the lowest variants. Now, one thing that is a concern in India is the cost of providing these basic safety features, which is sort of commonplace in Europe and US, is very high. And if you were to look at just dual airbag and ABS, it costs as much as 5% of the total car's bill of material. And therefore, we need to look at how we work with suppliers to reduce the cost of providing safety to the consumer. It's not a technology it's not a technology issue, it's a cost issue. And perhaps the government of India can also take a look to see whether they can exempt safety features from excise duty or VAT, which will certainly reduce the cost of these features for consumers by about a third. But there is no doubt that Indian cars have to become safer. There is no doubt that Indian roads have to become safer, and that requires the drivers to have more discipline, requires the road users to have more discipline. I think we're going in the right direction. We need to accelerate the pace. Every OEM is willing to spend on technology, willing to spend on features for safety. Everybody would like to sell the safest car. Every consumer would like to buy the safest car. It's just a matter of how do we make it affordable for everyone.
Sometimes we don't believe that it's true of every OEM, but of course we're glad that you think so for sure. What I want to quickly ask you is the point you mentioned about how some of this equipment is a little bit more expensive here to source in India for manufacturers who are actually making cars here as compared to somewhere in the West. Do you think that will change once there is a legislation and economies of scale kick in and everybody does have to start including these features?
I think economy of scale certainly would make a difference. Even today, most of the equipment that goes into an ABS or an airbag is imported, and therefore the costs are high. There is import duty involved, and I'm sure that once the production starts in India, the costs will come down. Right now, as I mentioned, that just to provide dual airbag and ABS, the basic feature, cost about 20,000 rupees in material cost, which is about 5% of the vehicle's cost. And that, by the time we had excise duty and VAT, becomes 30,000 rupees to the consumer, which is a lot of money to spend for a consumer who is just stretching to be able to buy a car. And we certainly need to bring it down to a level where it does not hurt. But what I'm encouraged with is the fact that in a recent launch, the Scorpio, we had offered airbag and ABS as an option, even in a low variant, which is S6. And 60% of the consumers out of the ones who ordered S6 opted to buy these features. That means there is certainly a lot more desire amongst even people who are spending lesser money on buying a model, that is by buying lower variant. There's a lot more desire in these consumers to pay for safety. That was not the case even 3-4 years ago. So there is certainly a bigger pull, and a bigger pull will always work even faster than any regulation could do. So therefore, if awareness comes in, I think every automaker will put in these features.
Right, Pawan, just do stay with us for a few more minutes. Rohit Baluja, I want to ask you this question because when we first started talking about this, even on the show and on our network, that was the one missing link, isn't it? That it wasn't just about the consumer not being aware, but a lot of people not caring as well. 60% of the base variant of the Scorpio getting people to opt for the airbags. That's unusual, that's new. Are you encouraged?
Yes, very much so. And I always believe that it is the consumer who is not aware. That's the basic factor. The consumer is not aware at all. Every consumer believes that the vehicle he's buying is safe, and that's not a criteria for his buying. He believes that. And that's where the whole missing link is. And when you look into the selling, you never get airbags or ABS or electronic stability systems individually. You get them as packaged with special leather seats or etc. etc. Right. And the whole cost goes up to about ₹1,00,000 or ₹1,20,000, which the consumer perhaps doesn't want to. But if you give the consumer that this is a package with airbags, and you are not safe without the airbags and without the ABS or electronic control systems, the consumer will go and buy them.
And I want to quickly add here that in fact 6 months ago, that's exactly what we threw at the industry, and it was in fact Mahindra who's the only one that's responded with that. So kudos to the Scorpio team. But want to quickly ask you, Mr. Chibber, we've been hearing about an imminent legislation that's going to revise all these old archaic laws, because very often manufacturers like to say that, hang on, we are meeting all requirements laid down by the government. Now those requirements of course are grossly inadequate, we know this. Tell us a little bit more about the new draft bill.
road safety is now a part of this act. The earlier act did not focus on road safety. This new legislation has a very specific focus on road safety. We had earlier intended to set up a separate authority to provide an institutional framework for road safety. That has been going on for 4 or 5 years. In fact, a draft legislation had been sent to the last parliament. And now that has been put on hold. There would be no separate need to take a legislation for a road safety authority. It will be part of this proposed bill. In the interim, what is proposed is that through executive order, we will set up the National Road Safety Authority. For that, a draft cabinet note has already been prepared and is presently under circulation.
Pavan, back to you. Whenever there is a legislation change or any kind of new policy, of course, there's always a little bit of a adjustment period, if you will, that industry is allowed so that they can adopt some of these new initiatives. What kind of lead time do you think that the industry will need? That's one. And then what kind of lead time do you think you will need in terms of the vehicle portfolio that you already work with?
See, unfortunately, for safety regulations, the basic structure of the car has to be changed. Unlike emission, where you could only be changing engine or after treatment, or fuel efficiency, which is primarily coming from engine and other friction material. Therefore, in safety, I think to make basic changes will require almost a full product development cycle, which means 3 to 4 years of lead time to completely implement whatever the new regulations are. As I said earlier, that technology-wise there is no issue. Any regulation can be implemented by Indian manufacturers and MNCs in India. But what we need to be careful about is that you cannot look at safety in isolation. Safety regulation, emission regulation, fuel efficiency regulation all have an influence on each other. And therefore, when we make regulation, we need to take into account that our objective is to focus on all of these three. We have to improve safety, we have to reduce emission, we have to improve fuel efficiency, and this should be done in unison. So if it is done in unison and also proper lead time is given, there is no difficulty on part of the auto manufacturers to put that in. The only concern that we would have is that are we going to make the vehicle so unaffordable to the consumer that they cannot buy? And that also we cannot ignore the fact that each of these things, fuel efficiency, emission and safety, cost money, and we have to keep that in mind. Of course, we cannot compromise with these things only because of commercial consideration or price consideration, but we cannot ignore the fact either.
All right. Well, that's encouraging enough. Pavan, I know you have to get going, so we thank you for joining us today. It is, of course, great to hear what you had to say about this, and more power to you when it comes to adding those safety features. Thank you again.
Delighted. We'll wait to see what others have to say. Thank you.
Absolutely. That's always the case, isn't it? Volvo, Thomas, has always used safety as a marketing plank, in fact, in most markets. It's by default seen as the safest car on the road by many as well. That didn't just happen by chance. I mean, this was a conscious decision to always keep that at the front.
Yeah, Volvo was established in 1927, and the two founders of the Volvo car company, they said that cars are driven by people, and so that everything we do in the company is and must remain safety. So we have been talking about safety and awareness of how to make our cars more safe on the roads. We have now a vision that by 2020, which is only about 5 years from now, that if you sit in a Volvo car, we actually promise you and we can guarantee you that you cannot die in a Volvo car. So that is some of the technologies that we're moving forward with Volvo cars.
And that's, of course, that's a tough challenge to meet, I know, because there's so many other external things that affect what happens to you when there is an accident, and not just the car. But of course, it's good to hear that. David, very often the argument that's made, and you've heard this the last time you were here as well in India 6 months ago, that it's different for a company like Volvo because you're talking about a premium car buyer in the first place who's willing to shell out a lot more money for many other things, not just these things, and so expect safety to be a part of that package. But Mahindra, for example, has to deal with a mass end of the market, and then there are guys like Nissan and Datsun who have to go even lower. The argument that the consumer doesn't want it, we've tried to refute that because consumer just doesn't know. But what about that whole meeting the price competitiveness that a market like India throws at you?
Well, a very interesting fact is look at the cost of airbags over the last 15 years. They've fallen by 60%. That's the kind of cost reduction that manufacturers who are buying airbags from specialist companies have gained. And as we reach a much more global integrated industry, and if, for example, there was a regulation in India that mandated the main UN frontal impact crash test standard, then every single new car in India would have to have at least a driver's airbag. The same sort of thing is happening in Brazil, in China, and so on. These economies of scale just keep on giving to us, which means that safety becomes much, much more affordable. And so I think that's why it's so important that India takes action, as we hear they will, to set a minimum set of regulations, because that accelerates those cost advantages. But I think the other point made both by the colleague Mahindra and Mr. Baluja is the government can incentivize a sales tax reduction, those sort of things, even for a temporary period, can have a fantastic sort of accelerator effect.
Great incentive, yeah. Yeah, and that incentive always works, especially a financial one. We know this. We're going to slip into a short break. Before we do that, though, a very quick look at a statement and a response we do have from Nissan in India, which, of course, heads the Datsun business. This is, of course, remember, a test that was carried out on the Go with Nissan and Datsun having been informed and invited to the test as well. Let's quickly bring up that reaction for you. Nissan says that the automotive regulation standards in a fast-growing country like India is constantly evolving, and as a global manufacturer, they're willing to adopt as well as help evolve standards in vehicular safety. So, at least an acknowledgement, if you will, and remember the fact that if there is a change in legislation, well, then all manufacturers will simply have to offer those options, cost or not. Short break. We are back with a whole lot more, and remember, there's that other car. That's a result you definitely want to see. Right, so that's a snapshot of the chief causes of death on Indian roads. You can see the way it breaks up. These are 2012 figures coming from the National Crime Records Bureau. Scary statistics indeed. Welcome back. Now, as I promised, the other car crash test that was carried out. Now, this is a car that many of you will want to know about. In fact, when we did the first round of tests, I can tell you that we heard from so many of you asking for this model. It is a very popular model, sells in huge numbers, the Maruti Suzuki Swift. The car was tested in two variants, both made at the Manesar plant, that's Maruti's plant outside Delhi. One was a car with airbags. That's the standard model for the Latin American market where it's exported from here. And the other one, of course, that's the base model here in India, a car without airbags. Let's take a look at the Indian model. So as you can see, the car holds its integrity better than what we saw with the Datsun Go. Yet, as you can also see, the dummies are getting lurched forward. No airbags means no protection for them, of course. All right, so what are the results here? Let's take a look at the results as well for you. The lack of airbags, of course, instantly means that the car fails the test. But having said that, you still see that there is poor protection for the driver, particularly because of the steering column being right in front. The body shell is still rated as unstable, but as I mentioned, holds its integrity a lot better than what you saw with the previous test. Take a look at what happens there because of a lack of airbags. The color coding on that chart tells you that anything that goes to red is extremely, extremely poor, which means fatal injuries. You've got to try and stay as green as you can. The crash test dummy on the passenger side doing a little bit better than the driver. So, of course, receiving no stars there. That's the Maruti Suzuki Swift. That's for India. And a very crucial point being made here, and I think that's something that we've been talking about extensively right when this whole thing started. That's the point you want to try and drive home as well, isn't it, Max? That a car like this, throw in airbags and it makes a huge difference straight away.
Well, this is the thing, and that's why it's so important to persuade people to buy the cars with airbags, but even more important that the manufacturer, as Rohit said, should offer it as an option. Because once people know that on the one side the car is really dangerous, but with the airbag it's very safe, relatively speaking, then people will buy it with an airbag. But if they don't know and the airbag's not available, they can't do that.
Give us the flip side of that, David. The car with airbags that was tested for the Latin American market, how did that do?
Well, it scored 3 stars, which is a survivable crash. It's a much better result. And I think there are 2 things here that are really powerful. One, with the airbag, the car would pass the minimum UN regulation. Mm-hmm. whereas the Datsun Go, even with an airbag, wouldn't. And that's because the body shell in the Datsun collapses so totally that it's pointless to fit an airbag. But actually here, as you're seeing, this is the version that's sold in Latin America. The airbag is working quite well. The body shell isn't fantastic, but it hasn't collapsed as it did with the Datsun Go. So you get a 3-star result. And that's a difference between life and death in terms of real-world incident. So that's why it's so important to adhere to the UN regulation, which would mean that that kind of car with the airbags would be the only one available. There wouldn't be one available without airbags.
We, of course, want to quickly get a reaction there on all of this from Mr. Chibber. But before I go to him, tell me this, Dr. Baluja, the whole awareness point in India, which has always been lacking. I know institutes like yours have been trying to change that situation. Seeing these kind of images, being flashed on TV screens the last time seemed to get people to notice. So therefore, do you think there is more of this that needs to be done? We need to start seeing this so that people believe that there's a problem?
No, I don't think so. Yes, that the consumer needs that sort of an awareness, which the consumer doesn't have at all. So yes, they need it, but it will not reach down to every consumer. What we need is regulation. And today, luckily, with the new government, the Prime Minister's call for Make in India, it does not really mean that Make in India, whatever you like. Make in India the best of quality. Make in India those standards and safety, what you're selling abroad and in India together. And it is definitely down to the consumer that the consumer must know how safe the vehicle is.
And because the good part here is that you already have a case for this, because a lot of these manufacturers in the mass space are also exporting in huge numbers. So it's not as if they're not aware of those requirements for sometimes the very same model. Mr. Chibber, let me ask you that then. Will India get its own NCAP as well for crash test ratings, and will it sort of cover things like safety equipment as being a part of that? Because as David was just pointing out, just simply adding airbags is not always the answer.
Unfortunately, we have for too long been listening only to the manufacturing industry, the auto industry. And this has retarded our development of the standards. What we now aim to do is to harmonize our vehicle standards to the extent possible with the European architecture. In that context, there would be significant amendments to the vehicle standards. Currently, you might be surprised to learn that very few of the automobiles being manufactured in India and sold to the Indian consumer are conforming to what could be the European safety standards. It's a pity, but it's also a fact that most Indian consumers are not aware of this. We hope that this kind of a gap between our standards and specifications and those of consumers in the other parts of the world, those will get narrowed down. The NCAP, the National Crash Assessment Program, this is an essential element in the process of testing as to whether our vehicles are meeting the global standards. Unfortunately, currently we do not have a crash testing facility within the country. If vehicles have to be checked out, they have to be sent to other geographies where such facilities are there. We hope to have our first crash testing facility ready in the next couple of months. This is going to be based out of Chennai. And it is only once this facility is ready that we would be then mandating the NCAP, India's NCAP, as an essential and as an essential ingredient in terms of making sure that the vehicles that are on the road and available to the Indian consumer are meeting the minimum standards.
That is actually very encouraging, because this is a complete shift from what we had been hearing or not hearing from government for quite some time. So do you believe we're finally getting somewhere now? I mean, I remember when we first met, that whole sort of frustration over not being able to get through to the lawmakers seems to be changing.
This seems to be a very big change, absolutely. And of course, I mean, seen from an Indian point of view, you make a car here and the safe version is sent abroad. The version that's on sale here is very dangerous. And I think no government could allow that to continue for very long. So, I mean, very encouraging to see that this change of policy.
Got to slip into a short break, I know, but very quickly, Thomas, from you, the experience that Volvo has had coming into this market? I know again over here safety was not necessarily a plank you used very extensively because the consumer wasn't demanding that from you in a sense. But in most markets that you go to, that's always been the case. You're identified as being the player with the safest cars. What happens in an emerging market vis-a-vis a developed market? Is that something that you find helps create awareness?
Yes, it does, and I think entering an emerging market versus a developed market is the gap of the awareness. I think the awareness, we do try to bring with different activities more awareness to the consumers. Today, I mean, even you see people driving a car without a seatbelt, and without the seatbelt at 20 kilometers an hour, you'll damage your face. That's the minimum that's not going to happen. You would see people driving with the mirrors closed. And why do you have mirrors? I mean, but then they close the mirrors. 30%, I count myself. And so the awareness to bring that there has to be there. It has to be a real push. And I'm very confident with the new government as well and all the stakeholders. There's a lot of activities happening to increase the awareness of safety. We will be working more with schools, especially to teach the children that they should sit in the back in a child's seat and not sit in the front without the seatbelt and just standing there as well.
In India, though, unfortunately, a lot of this just has to be policed. I'm sure you can vouch for that, Dr. Baruja, because a lot of times, awareness isn't the only thing that works. People don't wear seatbelts; they keep the mirrors closed. In Delhi, it's probably the worst. Just making sure that the police fines them more heavily. I mean, what's the solution to get people to just start doing it?
I think it's more of awareness that what if you enforce that, and many cars still are not offering one of the side mirrors.
Yeah.
It's at extra cost. And it is not enforced, it is not informed that why do you want it. And as more enforcement comes in, you'll have to see the rear cars at the back. You'll have to make sure that you're overtaking in a proper way, and then people will be using it. And I'm quite sure with this new bill coming in, there's a lot of hope in anticipation that much would improve in road safety management.
Well, they have to change. They simply have to change. That's what we've been saying right from the start. Another short break here on our Safer Cars for India initiative. Please join us after that. Welcome back. Safer Cars for India, something we certainly want to see happen all around us very quickly. As you know, we also have with us a studio audience here. I know I have Mr. Aluwalia here with us. Sir, if you could tell us about your experience.
I met with an accident around Sonipat. My car, which was being driven by my driver, my son was sitting in the front, and me, my wife, and one of my friend's daughter was sitting on the rear seat. There was another truck having all Maruti cars. They just banged straight head-on with our car. Now, whose fault was that? Very difficult to comment. Perhaps both the sides. The only person who was wearing a belt at that time was my driver. And the car did not have that airbags. We all, except the driver. In fact, I had fainted. My wife had gone into coma. My son had all the sprinkles in his eyes because of that window screen breaking, and the car was totally damaged. We all were taken to a hospital by someone who was a God-sent person, and we were in coma for 2-3 days. My son was in a bad shape, but luckily, they say that you get one life to live, but we are the people who got second chance to live. Seat belt is a must. There should be some signal coming. Like I find in some cars there's a beep coming that you are not wearing a seat belt. But all over the world, if this thing can be made, I think it would be a good idea.
Increasingly now, in fact, even for rear seat belts in many markets, you do have warning beeps and an alarm going off. If nobody belts up, there's also a visual warning for the driver to alert people. That's an attitude change that's required. I remember at the Volvo headquarters seeing a film about how the person at the rear not wearing a seat belt turns into a projectile is actually a greater danger to people sitting in front in the event of a collision because you get thrown forward. Is there an easy way to do this in terms of those warnings, etc.? I mean, is that an expensive option?
No, it is a standard with all of Volvo cars, and to my knowledge, it's quite nominal cost for that. What I would like to say is, let's say in the front, if you have the seatbelt, that's fine. But the person in the rear, let's say normal 50, 60 kilos, at the speed of an accident, a frontal collision, maybe at 60, 70 kilometers an hour, the person behind you actually becomes 1,000 kilos. And then you have 1,000 kilos coming towards you in your back. So it will break your seat and it will break you as well.
It was 14th February, Thursday, 1991. The saddest day of my life. I was in a place called Aligarh around 7:30 in the evening. My father, who used to drive a two-wheeler for almost 30 years, they were invited for a marriage party. My mother and my father picked up the helmet, and while just about to start, my father calls me verbatim, "Ye helmet rakh lo, shaadi mein helmet kahan sambhalenge?" These were the verbatim comments of my father. And 1 hour back, I get a call from my mother, "Deepak, please rush to the medical college. Your father is seriously injured." But then he had collapsed, he had died, he was wearing a suit, and there was only one single cut in his head. And that fateful day, in Aligarh, helmets were not compulsory. He was wearing for ages, but that particular day, he missed taking this helmet. So my advice to youngsters here watching and who are present here, see, accidents never come announced. They always happen by chance or so always take all precautions of safety, whether you are driving a two-wheeler or a four-wheeler, never compromise with it.
All right, so we've been discussing road safety. Of course, we started off by talking about safer cars, but remember that it's a whole lot more than that. And luckily, the new blueprint we're talking about does cover a various amount of aspects of what is going to be required to change these statistics, these horrific statistics. Yes, questions. You have a question right there.
So my question is that when can we expect this safer cars at normal price in the market?
Well, what constitutes a normal price is something we can keep debating. But David, that's a very valid point, and that's the one which in India everybody keeps asking. So how do you counter that?
If you take the Suzuki Swift we saw, the 3-star car, I'll use US dollars, but the unit cost of a typical airbag unit is $50 that the manufacturer will pay to the supplier of airbags. So to make that car go from 0 to 3, I think would cost maybe around $100 US. That is not a great deal of money when you think of the
6,000 to 8,000 rupees.
Yeah. And the good thing about the Suzuki Swift is it will go from 0 to 3 with just a couple of airbags.
And remember that when it comes to development costs, most of these cars are global products, so they already have that engineering in place. It's simply a matter, in most cases, of just adding that equipment, unlike something like a Datsun Go, which will need re-engineering. So it's not a huge cost issue. Don't always believe the manufacturers when they tell you that. Warning systems in the car, I mean, we have actually certain cars where there's a voice that tells you don't forget to wear your seatbelt, selling in India. Do you think that's going to make a difference? I mean, what guarantees this?
I think it helps. The thing is, it's absolutely essential to remember that the airbag and the seatbelt work together. Either of them on their own are not so effective. You need both, and that was the lesson from America. For a long time in America, people didn't put seatbelts on because they had airbags, and they thought, well, the airbag will take care of it. But the experience is that it doesn't. You must wear the seatbelt and the airbag if you want to get the full benefit.
And how do you change that? Again, it's awareness, it's also certain systems within a vehicle, you think?
Well, the seatbelt warning, of course, now in Europe, it gives this beep. And I got into trouble because I was the chairman of Global NCAP from one of the bosses of the big companies, because he said, our customers are all complaining. They keep getting this beep, 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 and they want something to put in to stop the beep. But in fact, after a few years, it does actually get people to wear a seatbelt. The habit comes. And of course, you don't have to worry about the airbag. It's there, and it'll only go off if there's an accident.
Yeah. And that beep, the more annoying, the better, because hopefully that makes people, that's what it's for. Yes.
Siddharth, my question is, we have seen Maruti Suzuki is really working hard to develop an automatic transmission at a cheaper price, like we have the Celerio in the market right now. None of the car companies are actually working on doing something where safety features like ABS, EBD, and airbags is coming as mandatory feature. Like Honda, when it came with the ZX variant, the airbag was it was a standard feature throughout all the model variants. But later on, they discontinued it. It was seen in the Verna also. The SX variant had 2 airbags and the optional had 6 airbags. Now they're only having 2 airbags in the optional variant as well, because they wanted to glamorize the car more. So why we don't have certain coming in the legislature where we can see that all the manufacturers safety features are more mandatory and people are safe, and as well as an awareness should be created. Like if we see the premium segment market, people, especially they are very practical. Why should I wear a seat belt? So what they do, they just strap the seat belt and they leave it. So at that point of time, I feel awareness is something which is more important than any other thing.
That is true. I mean, you know, the point he's made, and we should applaud to the good examples. I mean, Mahindra had a good example. There's also Toyota with its Etios now, which is a mass product, going standard with airbags. And this is all a sort of a result of some of what you've started. But David, this point about, you know, and this is what manufacturers always throw at you, saying, oh, you know what, the consumer doesn't want it. So we do it and then they don't care for it, so then we take it out. How do you go past that?
Well, it sounds like a classic chicken and egg, but I think you've got to do two things. If India can regulate to the minimum United Nations standards, it's very important. These are UN. They're not actually European. They're UN standards, and more countries around the world are applying them. And as that happens, we will get the cost benefits. And there is a UN Decade of Action for Road Safety, so it's a good opportunity for India to lead there. That will bring down the cost of these technologies, and then NCAP type work, the sort of things we're doing, will raise awareness. Because I think we're all very impressed and pleased that just since January, and the fantastic work that NDTV has been doing in your car and bike show in highlighting this, we can sense that there's growing awareness. And it's those combination. You want regulatory push and demand pull from the consumer. And then you will get safer cars, cheaper, more affordable. And this is a global challenge, not just a challenge for India. But if India wants to lead the world in automotive production, which it can, it's already the 6th largest producer of passenger cars in the world, it's going to have to do this even from a commercial point of view, which ties into your Prime Minister's call for Make in India.
And that's something that hopefully will revolutionize the way things are being done today and change not just attitudes, but also real things happening on the ground as well. We're completely out of time, gentlemen. All of you, thank you so much for being here, and we'd especially like to thank Global NCAP for bringing this initiative so strongly to India. Thomas, thank you for your time as well, and Dr. Baluja, you've also done a remarkable amount of work there, so thank you for that and for being here today. Mr. Chibber as well, thank you. We do hope that this draft bill sees the light of day very, very soon, and many thanks also to Pavan Goenka and our studio audience. Please always remember that when it comes to safety, the change has to start with you. It has to start with your attitudes. Insist that your loved ones wear seatbelts, wear helmets, don't use their cell phones when they're driving, and that'll probably make a difference or start to make a difference with just that much in the very first place. Thank you for joining us.